Yeah, I wonder, I mean, I don't know what Heidegger would say. I'm given that he says he's doing an ontology, not ethics. Anyway, I don't know. I mean, to me, it does seem like there's values kind of implicit in this stuff, but I don't know. Maybe he would say something I mean, he wouldn't use these words because he would probably hate
Why do we
this.
care? Why do we care what he would say?
Why do I care what I think?
Why do we care what he would say? We can't figure it out anyway. It's
Oh,
unrecoverable.
yeah.
I mean, A, it's unrecoverable. But B, what's the relevance of it? He wrote what
Well,
he wrote, and we own it now, and we can interpret it as we like.
that's
Yeah, but
yes.
I guess what I would prefer to do is, and probably maybe Heidegger himself would say this is impossible, but to try to keep separate what Heidegger said and what I make of it. So
Well, what
I would
Heidegger
like,
said is absolutely recoverable. So I think we should keep separate what Heidegger said from what we make of it. But
that's all I'm saying.
what Heidegger would have said is unrecoverable.
Hmm.
Right? How Heidegger would have taken something else that it was, if never presented to him, or if it was, we have no record of it.
Well, I'm sure
Then
he has comments about these ethical implications because he himself said, didn't he? I mean, I can't put my finger on it, but that I'm not doing ethics, I'm doing ontology. So I thought he was pretty strident about that.
Well, yeah, but I'm not. I just want to say, like, yeah, we're all in. I think we're all in agreement that yeah, he's not trying to produce an ethics, but an ontology, and that there are certain implications of that ontology, and what those mean for our ethics. It's not an easy answer because, like Deirdre, like you were pointing out, I was like, you made like a light bulb go out. Like I was like, whoa, like what you were doing and saying was so totally like in line exactly with Heidegger's like whole MO, like his framework, his style was like that exactly. That's exactly what we're talking about. That you can't remove yourself. We can't totally disentangle. Like we're talking about this before we recorded, yeah, about this ethical thing where this guy says, I'm totally alone and I don't want to pay taxes because fuck you. I'm by myself and I don't need help and fuck you. And I was like, that seems crazy. That seems like hard to believe in and support if you do something like agree with Heidegger on his ontology of being with and the implications of care in a being with and whether that's an ethical implication. Like I don't want to start making claims like that. I'm just saying like you should it's a claim about care and this guy doesn't seem to care. And like you're saying, like in relation to this person and this problem of the contemporary, like as like in 2023, yeah, what Heidegger would have said or whatever, he that the very point we're getting at, I think, is our connectedness like to Heidegger as a member of our community and how inseparable we kind of are from Heidegger and Heidegger from us now that we're reading it, and how totally counterthetical that is to that sort of idea we were talking about of like a psychic island, and the ethical implications of that sort of approach is what I'm saying. That's kind of what I'm saying.
yeah, well, I mean, and he wasn't an ethicist, and we know he was an asshole because he was a Nazi, right? But his ontology can have a meaning to us that may be ethical for us. We have to do philosophy, right? Not just read history of philosophy and just do history of philosophy. We can read what he said, and that's great.
I'm going to do exactly
That's what I'm saying.
the wrong thing, do something against what Deirdre Ann said, which I think she's correct. But so here's what I'm guessing he might say about that mode of thinking of yourself as an isolated individual, because he seems to think everything is how does he put it, is derivative or derived from this more primordial condition. So so for example, being able to treat objects as isolated, I can never remember these two. Present at hand, is that right? The ones that are not embedded in the context.
Yeah, that's right. President.
Okay.
Yeah.
So being able to, present at hand, that mode of being is, again, I forgot the word, but derivative of this more primordial mode of being. maybe he would say the same thing about the person who, or like Descartes, or someone who thinks of themselves as an isolated person, that the possibility of that conception of humanity is probably, I'm guessing he would say, is derivative of this more primordial being with, that it's there are just weird things that happen such that you can get that kind of mode of being. But anyway, I guess that's probably beyond the scope here, since like Deirdre said, I don't know if he ever talked about that.
Yeah. I don't know. There's kind of a conceptual persona of these authors themselves where you can kind of perform that yourself as a way of interpreting it, but that is obviously distinct from what they actually wrote and also what they would have said themselves about whatever it is. But I think that's kind of what we're doing here, at least, is something like that. We can give our own interpretations of it. That's what we're doing. But that's always a kind of, I mean, if it's a good interpretation, it's at least inspired by our own interpretation of the conceptual persona of Heidegger in some sense. At least that's the way I'm taking it now. But I definitely think what Hunter was saying is definitely right. That okay, so he's not doing ethics, not explicitly, but there's definitely ethical implications to the ontology that he's doing. And I think Hunter also expressed that well, what those ethical implications are. And the person who would say, I'm a Robinson Crusoe, even in the midst of my, like white suburban neighborhood, just totally enclosed in my castle. But still that castle is a being in the world in which Dasein dwells, and if it's completely closed off, it's gonna die. Like that's how if you want to kill a town, just knock off its supply chains, and then you get a deficient mode of being with, and then it dies. Because I think Dasein is a being, it has to be a being within one sense or another. Although, so how do you use the terminology of deficient modes for things that would be the kind of negative of what they are? But then I think he rightly says though, but okay, what is primordial here really is the existential structure of being with, although we can't have all these different types of deficient modes of it, in which it really does express itself in some way as not being with. Yeah.
I think that was the word I was looking for, is deficient mode. So that like the isolated individual is a deficient mode of being with, and is really dependent. It's dependent.
I think if you've really tried to isolate isolate yourself, like to the extent that Chase and maybe Hunter are talking about there, where you've got this person who's really trying to be an island unto themselves, in both a physical and a social sense. I think you're trying to, it's as if you're trying to stop yourself from being thrown, right? You're trying to stop the die from being from moving, and you're terminating in a sense you're terminating your some of your essential characteristics of Dasein, because you don't have that. To the extent that you're successful at stopping being with, I think at some point you're beyond deficient mode.
Hmm.
I mean, imagine you go off and you live on an island by yourself, literally, and you have no contact with other human beings. Are you really human? Are you really a Dasein kind of being anymore at some point? If you never again contact any.
Yeah, I think it's similar. When a while back, we were talking about, the problematic um, wild child who never is in society. A completely isolated person might be, I don't know, they might not be recognizably Dasein anymore. So, Hunter, looks like you're.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I remember that's exactly right. That's what I thought of was when we talked about whether or not uh whether or not Dasein is just this, whether or not being born in a human body gives you a free pass, like a free Disney fast pass to Dasein mode, which I think Deirdre, I think you're right. I think it doesn't. I think being born in a human skeleton does not give you like a freebie into being a Dasein, like a guarantee. Um, and I think that I guess I mean, that's kind of he says so in the preface. Like, he's trying to parse out, like, okay, what is that? What is the meaning of the being of Dasein? And so there are going to be things that it isn't and things that it aren't. And some of those things we might call, like, still a human in some sense. But I wonder because he talks about silence. You were talking about, like, this Robinson Crusoe. We were all, like, Deirdre, you and Chase, you as well, were like this being on an island, and actually talking to nobody and ever. And it makes me wonder what the difference is between that and I think I have an idea what the difference is between that and staying silent. Because he talks about that here in the section on sound, on speech and discourse and language. I think the reason that it's not the same as staying silent, and I want you guys to basically check my work here to see how good I'm getting it. I think the answer is it's not staying silent because you're not with anything to stay silent in relation to. You know what I mean? So like even if you're completely silent, even if you're shut out completely from society, and that is in a way a sort of staying silent, like he's saying here. What he's talking about is staying silent. The things he's talking about, like in discourse, that's in discourse. There is no discourse when you're completely alone, I guess, right? And you don't have a language.
Right, you're staying silent. You're staying silent with nothing to say, which is not staying silent, right? He says you have to have something to say in order to be silent. It's staying silent. I think of staying silent in this sense he talks about here as you're with you're with some interlocutor, and what he says, you're listening to them. Listening is an important piece here, right? Well, to listen, you got to stay silent, right? You can't talk while you're listening very well. Doesn't work. Doesn't work well. People try, but it does not work for them.
Yeah. So the thing about hearkening, I think, is pretty important, and in the sense of, yeah, it's definitely more than just, talking with words and whatnot. It's kind of um a kind of receptivity to things that goes along with the listening, that's what makes discourse possible. And also to go along with the listening, keeping silent. But I think the keeping silent thing is almost like a authenticity kind of functions like that. And that's, you have to be able to first have some kind of grasp of your own possibilities or whatnot, and then from that, when you still have the capacity to talk and have a discourse in the normal sense of the word, then you keep silent.
This is one of the reasons I really like the whole idea of Mitsein, or being with. I mean, I think he's really describing here some of the most rich times that you're with other people. When you're each talking, you're each listening. There's periods where maybe none of you are saying anything, but you're still there's some sort of communication, it seems, going on, some sort of I don't necessarily mean that the way he uses the word communication, but I may mean it the way he means communication. Um, that there's something still going on between you. There's not this you are sort of operationalizing this myth sign.
Yeah, I maybe I keep harping on this too much, but again, like kind of like last week with I forgot what the term was, but he's not like with discourse, he's not primarily talking about speaking, he's talking about a mode of being. At least that's what I get from this text. Discourse is existentially primordial with attunement and understanding. And the way in which discourse gets expressed is in language. So discourse is I believe I mean, maybe it's an existential, but it's an aspect of being in the world. And so discourse is, it seems to me that what he's saying is that language is possible because discourse is already an aspect of being in the world, and discourse makes intelligible the meaning of the world, but discourse there again is not necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily spoken. Language is how discourse gets expressed, but I don't think discourse is language.
Yeah, so you had an interesting way of distinguishing um discourse and language, and I can't remember exactly what it was. It had to look, exactly at what the text is saying. Um, because they are distinct in a way, but I don't know. Does anybody have the actual place in the text where he says what their relation is?
Well, let's see, in Heidegger, it's kind of in the middle of page 161. In the Stambau, it's at the top of 156, but he begins a paragraph. The way in which discourse gets expressed is language. The totality of words in which discourse has its own worldly being can thus be found as an interworldly being, like something at hand. Language can be broken up into world things objectively present. Discourse is existential language because the beings whose disclosedness it signifies significantly articulates have the kind of being in the world, which is thrown and reliant upon the world. Yes, then the next paragraph, as the existential constitution of disclosedness of Dasein, discourse is constitutive for the existence of Dasein. So that's the kind of thing that it sounds like discourse is this disclosedness of Dasein, but then as that first sentence I read, the way in which discourse gets expressed is language.
Yeah, and then on the first paragraph in section 34, towards the end there, the existential ontological foundation of language is discourse. So there's a relation of founding and expressing, which is interesting. But I think that helps
And on
to
the next
separate them a
paragraph
little
too,
bit.
the next paragraph too, I think is important because the discourse is existentially equiprimordial with state of mind and understanding. And if you tried to say the same thing with language, it wouldn't make sense.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Right?
I think you're right.
A
Yeah.
common understanding of language wouldn't fit there.
So what exactly is language for Heidegger? So he talks about this the totality of words and significations. So would language be the way that discourse expresses itself through that totality of language? And then, or is, I know there's also a whole bunch of stuff going on with how the totality of significations of intelligibility is put into words. Words accrue to significations, but word things are not provided with significations. Yeah, I don't um
I think if I could just kind of interject, if that's okay.
yeah, go for it.
I had a kind of set of strong feelings here about this question about what is language for Heidegger, because or at least within the context of his work, not trying to, like what does he think or whatever, particularly is whatever. But I'm saying there are several different answers that are given here by Heidegger, I think. Throughout the section we read. Discourse is expressed through language, which would then imply that language is kind of the existent body and being of discourse in a sense. If language is how discourse is expressed, and then I took language to mean, by that definition, things like body language and like all those little things he talked about, those elements of discourse that aren't written signs, like a written discursive set of signs on a piece of paper, like beyond just that. So he calls it that, this expression of discourse, the expressive wing of discourse. He also refers to this this totality of signification, which that almost, several times I was like, is he going to call that language? Is he going to say like that is language straight up? But it didn't seem like he fully committed to calling language a totality of significations. But then things got really complicated here on Heidegger 166, on the second paragraph of Heidegger 166. And that's in the Macquarie and Robinson, that's page 209. But there's this weird moment in Heidegger, or in this page on 166, on Heidegger 166, where he poses a good question, a really interesting question, and then says, I don't really know. That's a good question. That's not my focus. And he's done that before. But this one really hit me. And it's this on the second paragraph. I'll read the part I'm talking about. It's a few sentences, the first few sentences. In the last resort, I'm going to adjust my mic. In the last resort, philosophical research must resolve to ask what kind of being goes with language in general. Is it a kind of equipment ready to hand within the world? Or has it Dasein's kind of being? Or is it neither of these? What kind of being does language have, if there can be such a thing as a dead language? What do the rise and decline of a language mean ontologically? We possess a science of language, and the being of the entities which it has for its theme is obscure. Even the horizon for any investigative question about it is veiled. Is it an accident that proximally and for the most part significations are worldly, sketched out beforehand by the significance of the world? They are indeed often predominantly spatial. But does this fact have existential ontological necessity? If it is necessary, why should it be so? Philosophical research has dispensed the philosophy of language. If it is to inquire into the things themselves and attain the status of problematic which has been cleared up conceptually. And then the last sentence I'm reading, well, I guess this is a big sentence. Sorry. Our interpretation of language has been designed merely to point out the ontological locus of this phenomenon in Dasein's state of being, and especially to prepare the way for the following analysis, in which, taking as our clue a fundamental kind of being belonging to discourse in connection with other phenomena, we shall try to bring Dasein's everydayness into view in a manner which is ontologically more primordial. Okay, I got you, Heidegger. I'm with you. The current science of language, total crapola. What we're doing, not exactly going to go there right now. He's basically saying, it sounds to me like he's saying, there's kind of a dumpster fire going on over there in the science of language department. We're not going to fuck with that. We're not going to deal with that. That's not right now. We need to focus. Look, our interpretation of language has been designed merely to point out the ontological locus of the phenomenon in Dasein's state of being. Okay, which, by the way, whatever that means, and that's basically what it means is everything he's said up to this point, and not answering these sort of little questions like, these categories of language. What I want to know from you guys is, to what degree do you think he has an answer to these questions he's posing in the first part? And I want to just say, because my belief, my reading of it, and I don't know if this is an incorrect reading, my reading of it was, at least, and is now, currently at least, that it seems like he's posing these questions and he has sort of a provisional answer and this sort of half answer that's kind of offered throughout the text, and he kind of gestures towards an answer, but he doesn't want to invest the time for a full explication of that whole realm, because it's not pertinent to his quest, basically. But I have almost kind of an issue with that. I know it sounds weird, but partly I'm kind of pissed off because I wanted to hear it. I was like, that sounds awesome. Yeah, what are the answers to the questions? And then I was mad he didn't want to answer them. At least it seemed like he didn't. But it raised a more fundamental question for me about other things in this whole schema. And it's like, well, what is language as being, and where did it come from? I think that's a good question. That's not a question he asks in this list. Where did it come from? Because I think a question that I keep having here for this whole thing is like, what is the realm of ontic creation? You know what I mean? Like, I get that we have a sort of ontological horizon, but then, like, what is the status of objects or entities that are outside of that horizon? And Heidegger has referenced that. He's answered that question sometimes. He's tried to be like, give answers. And it seems to me, he's like, it's obscure. It's kind of necessarily obscure. It's veiled. I don't know. I've never gotten like a solid thing. And so that question is what I'm asking here, and how that relates to language is like, did he have an answer to these questions about language that he's posing? And if not, what the fuck? What's with ontic creation? Where did the language get ontically created? How does ontic creation work for Heidegger?
Yeah.
So I got one intervention on that. I just don't know if I think that like maybe even the ask of creation is itself like, oh, how is language created? Like, to me, I'm just gonna parrot Fichte, where he's also being sassy, and his sassy answer to that is, that's a stupid question. That's essentially his thing. It's like, you misunderstand language. You precisely in that you ask that question, you misunderstand what the thing you're talking about is. That's what Fichte's sort of like kind of answer is. While he's like in that little essay he does, like, on the origins of language, he just is like, and in particular for this one, it would be like that's such an empirical question that I think that Heidegger throws that out in here. He's kind of like where does that get created is like, I don't know if I think he's like marked that out. It's such an empiric question.
I guess
that it's kind of like, oh, we're not doing that.
I guess in response to what you're saying, first off, I can see why you felt like, I agree. I'm glad you intervened, because like Fichte wrote like on the origin of language, like that's kind of that's exactly what I'm asking. So I'm really glad but I think like Hegel's whole project is kind of in response to that, and is like the opposite. It's like his whole fucking sorry, I'm swearing a lot. I'm a little drunk, but his whole question is, where did language come from? Like, really, and not like the empirical banal sort of, did a frog jump out of the water and then start barking at something and call it a word, like that sort of thing, whatever. Did a caveman grunt at something at some point? That's not important. It's how did language arise, sort of as a formal process from a consistent, seemingly pre-linguistic universe, if that can be conceived of. Like, if we're to conceive of some dumb idea of like that idea that doesn't make sense. What is the universe without consciousness? What is the universe without language or something? Like, that's an incomprehensible question. But like, when we think of this sort of solid thing that's at least somewhat consistent, and it's language, and the things consonant with language that are like error and misperceptions and confusion and deceit and irony. And how do those things emerge at all from an otherwise seemingly stable universal goop or something? You know what I mean? This split image. And I guess there is an answer to that in terms of, like, I guess human beings were created through science stuff, and we're limited. I guess that's an answer, but that's not the formal answer. You know, it's not the ontological answer that I'm looking for.
I don't know what Heidegger would say, but years ago, I saw a very short documentary that archaeologists were able to find extraordinarily old containers that appeared to have been used for shipping goods in the ancient Middle East. And what it appears, and again, this is written language, not obviously spoken language, which you're legitimately asking about, but I'm inferring from written language going backwards. And it appears that symbols, that the first writing wasn't words, it was numbers. You know, number of objects in something, right? And so one container would just have a certain number of the same thing. And then it was like, well, what if we put, I'm obviously embellishing, but what if we put two different things in the same box? Then you have to designate that there's two different, you know, but it seems, what was interesting, the archaeologists seem to be fairly confident that numbers, I should say numerals, preceded non-numeric written symbols for words. And so it was connected to trade and commerce, that, okay, we have 5, and now there was a symbol for fish or a symbol for wheat or something. And so it was actually numeric, noun based. And that's how written language, at least they weren't talking about ancient China, because that's a whole nother. At least in the ancient Middle East, written symbols, which now I don't know, like in I could see in a spoken language, or I could see if people are going to actually make noises out of their mouths, I could see why nouns would occur first, right? Because if this thing is running at us and that can kill us, whatever we call it, saber-toothed tiger, you know, whatever, you would want to communicate danger, but very specific to the thing that is potentially causing you harm. So just thought I'd throw that out there.
But there's language that precedes speech, right? I mean, Jason and I just recently read Signature Event Context, where Derrida talks about Condiac's work on that, and where he breaks down, talks about the idea that actions themselves can be linguistic, that they can be that there's a language as action, not to be confused with speech acts. And then even between that and speech, you may have something that I think Derrida referenced as articulative, not in exactly the same sense that Heidegger uses here, though if the translations were perfect, maybe he would mean the same sense, because he was a big Heideggerian. But what I took that to mean was speech with like hand gestures or body gestures, gesticulative language, whereas the language as action, at least according to Kondiak, seems to imply a broader, even earlier, even more, like when I punch you in the face, I've communicated something to you.
Yeah, so I think a common frustration of mine in this sphere is when like language gets just like it just becomes like a open vessel for all forms of like communicate, like first just like communication, like a communicative act. Like I was reading the Heidegger sections here, and I was like, silence is communicative. And I guess one of my point is that like because the discourse on language is so broad, and philosophers happen to just have very varied engagements with that discourse, that language becomes everything, but then language becomes just like signifiers. Language it gets very varied, and so I just like I wonder if like the whole actions part is that it's just not that's not necessarily language, that's communication, but it's a form of it's a form of communication, just so that language doesn't have to like carry the burden of like action in the world per se. And I don't think Heidegger would want it to carry the burden of actions in the world. I think he wants to really limit it to like a field of discourse.
Well, I don't know if I like that phrase "field of discourse," but I understand where you're going. I was responding to the some of the stuff on the origin of language discussion,
Yes.
which Heidegger's not really talking about at all.
Right. Well, I think for him, he would just go like, well, the origin is the fact that Dasein is Daseining. It's like it's being there in the world. It's being there, and it's in the world, and it's already with, and so it's kind of like he kind of seems to do like a very, very detailed explication of like a paragraph in Fichte's like essay, where it's kind of like, well, you're in the world, and then well, you come across some things that don't yield to your will, and they actually happen to be like those are people. So you start to come up with ways to talk to each other, to like engage in reciprocal exchange and purpose of action, so on and so forth. It's like language becomes like an instrumental, I think as Heidegger puts it, like a something present at hand. It just becomes like present at hand, like a tool when you're with people. But I think Heidegger kind of is like throwing that notion of language out.
So
he's just ready to hand.
What he says. Sorry. So what I'm thinking is that actually kind of like Hunter was saying earlier about what is the world without consciousness? That's not that's not even a sensible question, because it's a being with consciousness that is asking the question. And he's not focused on consciousness, he's focused on being. And my guess is if you said, well, how did so that discourse is one of the I'm not sure I'm saying this right, is one of the existential features of Dasein. Discourse is not language. Discourse is this communicability of meaning that is an aspect of being of Dasein. And that as one of, if it's either an existential or something like that, but as one of the aspects of what Dasein is, asking, how did discourse occur? I'm not sure it's a sensible question, because he's interested in articulating what Dasein, what the being of Dasein. And so, here we are, here's Dasein. It has these existentials, these characteristics. And if you asked what was Dasein prior to that, well, it's like asking what is the world prior to the world. I mean, how can you ask what being is? How can you ask what discourse is prior to there being Dasein? Because discourse only appears with Dasein. So, I don't know. My guess is that he, like Deirdre Ann said, he probably is just not interested in that question of origins because it's an unanswerable question. We are here. We are Dasein. Maybe there was some pre-Dasein, proto-Dasein. Who knows? But when you speculate about that, you're speculating about things that we can. It's kind of like Kant trying to talk about the noumena. You're speculating about conditions that we can't possibly know, because here we are in discourse with language. What is Dasein without language? It's not Dasein anymore.
And I don't
Yeah.
think he would. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the Fichte essay that you're talking about, but or not familiar with any of Fichte's any of Fichte's work really. But the I don't think he would. That doesn't seem consistent with what. And to describe it as being he's just spending a lot of time saying what is in one of a paragraph in Fichte seems a little problematic there, because that description you gave of what Fichte had to say, it doesn't sound consistent at all with Heidegger to me. We're talking about I think he would if you gave him that description within the context of being in time, that's not talking about being. That's talking about the origin of some. It's hypothesizing about the origin of an attribute.
I agree.
No, I agree with what you're saying. I think the vibes are very similar, and what like I should notice that the essay is it's him being a sassy boy, so it's blatantly like riffing off of the style of what's his name, French dude, prize essay, poverty, discourse on inequality.
You mean Rousseau?
Rousseau.
Yeah. He's doing a riff on Rousseau's, like the style of the discourse on inequality, and he's being a sassy boy. So he's like, oh, if you must insist on such a question, like, and then he proceeds to do it like Rousseau does, and so it's polemic. It's a polemic, but he does change gears at some point where he's kind of like, okay, now that I'm done being a sassy boy, here's what language is at its base roots, kind of deal. He like ditches the question. He's like, that's a dumb question. Here's a better one. And then he proceeds forward. But the only different, the sameness is this, that is, I was just saying that I think Heidegger and him would agree on kind of the silliness of like the concern. It'd be like, it's not an ontological question, therefore it's not part of what I do. And in fiction, would be like, yeah, I think it's kind of a silly pursuit to begin with, and then he would move on to a analytic of language itself. And I think that's what, I mean, Heidegger himself has a thing in here where he's like, I think it's 163, Heidegger 163, and he's like, if we took all these definitions together, he's like, we would still have poop, and we'd therefore need to do a focus study on Dasein.
Okay. I'm gonna. So Hunter, your question about the questions. So I think that he does have a provisional
Answer to a lot of them, and he may even have a a worked out provisional answer to some of them. But yeah, I think the question about the origin of language is pretty interesting, and how Heidegger does not do that. And I think for reasons that Nevitt was explaining, in that uh so this kind of transcendental type thinking about conditions, it's quite bad at being able to explain the genesis of those conditions. It really can't. So say, okay, think about Kant's notion that you've got the form of time, and that's what conditions basically time in the or empirical kind of clock time, and also experiences of whatever, that you could have objects is based off the condition of time. Where did the condition of time come from is completely, you can't answer that. So the kind of conditions of possibility thing, it can't at all, it tends to block off questions about how that could possibly happen, because how could time have a genesis without time? At that point, you don't know. So it's always already. It's always already. And you could definitely see this with Heidegger and language, when he talks about how, you never hear pure noise. It's always has some kind of signification to something. It's always, when I hear something, I hear the noise of a tire or a wagon or whatever he calls it. So I think that shows that, yeah, he thinks you basically, if you're Dasein, you're already zoomed into language, and it's kind of a absolute, either you don't have it, and then suddenly, bam, you've got it. The whole thing right there. I hear the wagon and I know it's a wagon. It's not just a pure noise. But I think this is still, I think there's another way to do this, where you can think of Genesis in a different way. By thinking about, well, if we think of the conditions that make these things possible, what if those conditions that make things possible are also the conditions that do explain the origin, that do explain the genesis? That's what, I mean, this is basically what this book is about. But I think Heidegger, what he's saying here about either have it or you don't, shows that he's not doing that. But so one thing else, it's even the thing about pure noise and whatnot. So okay, the logic of sense, that's where it goes through this genesis from, it's kind of it basically, okay, it's infant development. If you think about it like that, how does an infant be able to have language, the capacity for language? Because I mean, I think that's a good question for Heidegger, would be something like, okay, do infants, are they not Dasein if they, like, how do they instantly come out of the womb, and when they hear something, they know it's a wagon? I mean, I don't know the answer to that exactly, but that's kind of what the genesis of language, at least for Deleuze and the logic of sense, it moves through first a kind of, you have a pure noise kind of, and then through these stages where eventually you're able to separate the pure noise of bodily noises from this ideal state of sense of words. So being able to distinguish between bodies and language, that's ultimately what gives you the capacity to have sense. So that doesn't, you're not born instantly with that. And I think that's also why infants don't come out of the womb talking about like, oh, that was great being in the womb. I'm out of it now. No, they have to learn to use language, which I mean, the fact that uh, Heidegger is not addressing that at all makes me think that there's something he needs to think his conditions through in a way that is able to actually explain how you can go from not having language, but still having some kind of capacity to have language, to then having a kind of explicit ability to use language. But then I guess to defend what he's saying, or more his approach, his stated goal for this is a analytic of Dasein, and that's what he's doing. He's giving us this is what Dasein is, and then he has to explain what language is for Dasein. Although the way that he explains it doesn't allow for, at least for us to be able to understand that transition. Because I mean, are infants Dasein? Do they have language? Do they? What's
I
going on
don't.
with that?
I suspect he doesn't think that's an interesting question. Like at the point when they can ask the questions relevant to Dasein, they have Dasein, right? And prior to that, it's not really. I don't think he's interested in talking about Dasein, not about
So the answer would be no.
not about human beings, right?
So because
And not
infants
about the.
aren't asking about Dasein, they're not Dasein.
But I'm not saying that he's saying that there's a firm line there. I'm saying that's the point at which I think he begins to take an interest in it. If you asked him, I think if you asked him about a child, he probably would say sure, because think he's some, 8-year-old asking questions that have to do with that he would relate to thrownness. But we're thrown. Well, at what point, I guess when you're an infant, maybe you're still rolling, right? I mean, you're still in the air. You haven't even hit the table yet, right? And you're thrown.
I mean,
I don't see why it'd be a problem to say that children are not Dasein. I mean, traditionally philosophers have said, well, like Kant defined a person as a rational entity. And I think, like my daughter says, when I say young children are not rational, you can't reason with them. And she says, yeah, they're little psychopaths because, have you ever, the example I use, have you ever tried to reason with a 3-year-old and explain to the 3-year-old why they shouldn't take their friend's toy? I mean, it just doesn't work. And so, reason, they're potentially rational, but then reason develops as they emerge and mature. I don't see why it would be so scandalous to say something like that happens with children too, that they are potentially Dasein, but that potential is not develop, or it develops as they begin to engage with this social world.
I mean,
So
children have
I don't
like
think it's scandalous, but I would just say, well, how does that development work within the framework of what his actual theory of language is? That seems like a very important question to me.
Yeah, so I'm done. If you want to, think James, you're gonna say something.
I was just going to point out that, children pretty early on, I mean, even infants they have some vocal capacity, right? And I don't think it's crazy to assume that they're not just like little robots who are just like repeating what they hear, but that they have some sort of, you know, relatively restricted circle of meaning and references that they're working with. But I think I guess that's all I wanted to point out, that like developmentally, I don't think children are qualitatively different from how humans or adults, right, have a much larger, network of references.
I think to also a point here is to say there's a Heidegger 164 came down. He's like, on the other hand, what we approximately hear is not what is expressed in the utterance, even in cases where the speech is indistinct or in a foreign language. What we approximately hear is unintelligible words and not a multiplicity of tone data. Man, I think when babies are crying, the problem isn't that they don't know our language. I think it's the fact that we just don't have access to their unintelligible words, their expressions, their Wilkirk sign, their arbitrary sign they're using to attempt to disclose whatever. To potentially to not put it on the kids' point, the children's point, to disclose themselves to us. But cause I think we're it's almost as if it's like oh well, they obviously can't disclose themselves to me, therefore not X, and I think that's a like cats, they just refuse to use our language. I think that's the best way to put it. And it's only through this reciprocal process of existing with that they come to realize, that there's a hierarchy, and that is that I have resources that they need, and therefore they learn our language, and that's how they become embedded in our language games. But I think I think that kind of saves the kids there, and maybe flattens the philosophical problems about language acquisition and usage potentially. I don't know.
I mean, of all of the, I like that as sort of like this I mean, for this particular, we're talking about like a specific like case or example in this sort of fringe of Heidegger's whole corpus. You know what I mean? Like we're really zooming in right now on like infancy, on human infancy, and how their development, and I think it's interesting. But why I point out that we're kind of zooming in on it, is that I like that answer, that sort of provisional explication that you gave, Tristan, like from through a Heideggerian lens, like just sort of like using the tools we already have from the text, like what would be the analysis, right? And that I bought what you were throwing down, you know what I mean? Like I vibed with that. I resonated with what you're saying, at least if I were bought into Heidegger. But what the thing and I don't even know, I don't think this isn't like an issue we have to keep harping. Like we can move on, like genuinely, like if this is done or boring. But I just think it's noteworthy. It's interesting that this question that I don't know why I'm holding my hand up like Jesus. Like this question we're kind of looking at, like it's kind of obscure and mysterious and hard to parse, given what we have from Heidegger, and for reasons other than just that it's not directly in the text. Like he didn't specifically, yes, he did not talk about like the babies in the way we're talking about and really dig into the details like, and so yes, we will never get the full answer, I suppose. But I think for other reasons, I think that this area is kind of, it's I don't see, I think basically I put this in the chat, but I think that the project of focusing on the horizon in being and being with, like Chase and Nevitt, like you guys were saying, like from this framework, it being an unintelligible question to ask what life was like before, or yeah, like Nevitt, you put it really well. Like a subject, like or a Dasein without discourse is not that what like that's yeah, and I totally get that. I guess what I'm saying is, I think that there's some room, or for me, it seems like there's a good reason to start talking about non-being, like as a formal part of your theoretical framework. I'm just putting it forward here. I think there's good reason to bring in non-being in its relation to being. And I think that the lack of discussion of non-being, and it being, I think that the general rejection of those sort of impossible questions that you could only speculate about, right? Like those speculative questions, those purely speculative questions, I think that is like part. I think that is part and parcel of a avoidance. I don't want to say avoidance or rejection, or I don't know what his treatment of non-being is, but just so far a sort of silence on the subject of non-being. And it leaves us with big questions like, are babies Daseins, and like are wildlings or feral children, are they Daseins? Because I think that that discussion of how the relationship between non-being and being, and the way in which non-being either becomes or flows into or relates to being, would elucidate, I really do, the conversation of what non-Dasein status, like being not a Dasein, and then springing like coming from non-being into being. That sort of classic example, which I don't even really subscribe to, but that sort of classic illustration of springing into being from non-being. It's like that, like a child or an infant springing into Dasein, or being thrown into it, being thrown from non-being into being. Okay, so this is all based on just what I've read, which is very little Heidegger. So I'm not saying this is like Heidegger stinks, like that's it. This is my final refutation, but I just don't have like an answer to these questions. You know what I mean? And it's been bugging me for like a long time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question, especially so he does kind of give enough of a comparative contrast about some of the things that Dasein is not. Uh, Although that would be more, so Dasein is being in the world, and he says that that's not the same as equipment, and then present hand, objectively present things, the capital T. But then, so being in the world though would be something different than a kind of abstract category of being that would then give you a dialectic with nothing and then becoming. Yeah, okay. But no, but he does talk about nothing eventually, and actually we're going to read that pretty soon. I think in 2 weeks, the section on care and anxiety and the uncanny. He will talk about nothing then, in a very special way. And then in What is Metaphysics, he talks a lot about. That's where he has the infamous statement. What is it in German? Das Nichten or something like that. The nothings that Carnap was just like, that's nonsense, or however you say that in German. But What is Metaphysics is a pretty good essay. I would definitely recommend that to anyone interested in Heidegger. But that's where he really goes into the nothing, and also into attunement, mood, boredom, anxiety, the uncanny, that stuff. So I would recommend that. Yeah. I shall shut up and keep silent now.
I think it's a very interesting point you make, Hunter. I mean, I think, yeah, there is that he spends a lot of time on the other end of the cycle of life, right? Without spending much on that part of how something goes from nothing to being Dasein, not just being something. Because there's at least three states, right? You can be nothing, you can be something that's not Dasein, and you can be Dasein at a minimum, right? So, but somehow when we go from nothing to being thrown into the world, there's a biological piece that kind of leaves some gaps, right? It leaves some temporal gaps.
So if infants and small children aren't Dasein, what are they? I mean, they're not present at hand. They're not. Are they equipment? I don't know.
Nevitt said that they were like potential DOS signs, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, like because they know he talks about potentiality. Maybe it's like is there such thing as like a non-DOS sign that has a potential to be it, you know?
I just made that up, by the way.
I mean, that would
That was
that
pure
would make that's
speculation
kind
on
of
my
what
part.
Tristan was saying, also with the language acquisition thing, that a baby's cry is kind of that's its version of language that attempt to express and communicate itself, and then, but it's not the full explicit capacity of it like you have with in a your normal adult that can use language. But yeah, it still seems like there needs to be some kind of additional state of proto Dasein.
I think though, and I said it kind of half jokingly before, but I think maybe there is something there to the idea that I mean, being thrown is a process, right? You are thrown, and in your thrownness, you come to be Dasein, right? But his description of being thrown is a lot like the throwing of dice, and there's a point where those dice haven't hit the table yet, where they're rolling, but they haven't let your hand, but your hand is open. They're going, but they aren't there. They aren't there yet. Those are all points in this process in which your thrownness state is somewhat ambiguous.
So you could, as part of, okay, think about this. There's the process of shrinking PBRs, and that would be a process of getting thrown in the game.
PBRs, absolute ruin.
Yes. Because that's the only possible way to really get yourself thrown in the game.
I thought you were going to say that they couldn't have Dasein, but they were like shadows of Dasein, like children or cats. They're not really beer. So the analogy. So you have another form of carbonated water with a course.
These are
I think I'll throw it out there that I think PBR would be equipment. It would be ready.
When you reference PBR and Hunter is in the room, I have to again reflect back to Apocalypse Now because PBR are important in Apocalypse Now.
Wait, it is?
And Hunter, yes, and Hunter being Dennis Hopper.
So
wait, Blue Velvet? What? Hold on. These are all interesting references to me.
Blue Velvet.
I've watched the entirety of Twin
David
Peaks
Lynch movie.
Sorry.
Blue Velvet wasn't that the strange David Lynch movie from the 80s? But
yes.
He didn't drink PBR. He kept on talking about Heineken, and I just wanted to tell him shut up in the movie theater. Oh, you're gonna love this. This is a Heineken. What is this, a beer commercial or is this a movie? How much was Lynch paid to keep on having that schmuck talk about what was his name? Kyle MacLachlan? Whatever it is. Yeah, and then he was Paul Atreides in the really bad version of Dune in the 1980s. Get that clown out of there. My coffee table is more charismatic than that actor.
Hey, his lack of
Agent Dale Cooper in Twin Peaks.
Yes, in Twin Peaks.
No, Kyle MacLachlan is genius. No, I totally no. No, okay, so I just watched the entirety of Twin Peaks again, the first, second, third season, and Firewalk with Me. It's absolutely genius, and Kyle MacLachlan is amazing. Especially in the third season where he plays his opposite from the first two seasons.
Oh yeah,
simultaneously with also, if anybody's seen it, the character of Dougie So then plays a kind of like a brain dead version of himself also. So he's simultaneously playing three characters in the same show. Very well. And, yeah.
The PBR reference in Apocalypse Now is actually to the patrol boat. It's Patrol Boat River. It's a PBR, but
Oh, I see.
there's definitely a double entendre going on there.
Yes, and Dennis Hopper famously screams at Kyle MacLachlan about his preference, his predilection for Pabst Blue Ribbon in the movie Blue Velvet, in a very iconic scene. That's
So
what
there's multiple Dennis Hopper things, right? Dennis Hopper connects these.
Oh yeah. Okay, it's been maybe a few years since I watched Blue Velvet. Deirdre, we should watch that. Yeah.
Yeah, we should.
So I also have been watching this 5-hour explanation of Twin Peaks over the past 2 days. It's been lots of fun. I highly recommend it. But you gotta watch all of Twin Peaks first, which will take you quite a while. It's worth it though.
And it's hard to find.
I have the full set on DVD, but I think Hulu, I think maybe Hulu has the whole series. I'm not sure.
So it's on Amazon, but you have to
No.
get a Paramount Plus subscription, which I'm not sure how much it is. You know, I have it. They got me. And I'll probably be too lazy to actually cancel it. But anyways, sorry, I've gotten us off topic, but I love David Lynch, so any references I feel obliged to respond to.
So I'll be the rude guy that brings us back to the text. So I was going to read this first part of this paragraph. It's at the very bottom of Heidegger 162. The paragraph crosses onto 163. So he says, discourse is the structuring of the attuned intelligibility of being in the world. Its constitutive factors are what discourse is about, what is discussed, what is said as such, communication, and making known. These are not properties which can be just empirically snatched from language, but are existential characteristics rooted in the constitution of being of Dasein, which first makes something like language ontologically possible. So one reason I wanted to, again, just, I keep hammering this thing. Discourse is the structuring of the attuned intelligibility of being in the world. So discourse is not identical to language. Discourse is the structuring of attuned intelligibility. And that is a feature of any Dasein, every Dasein. And, like a lot of these things, he says that these things that we think are primary are actually secondary. So language does not come prior to discourse. Language only is possible because discourse is a feature of the being of Dasein. So part of what it means to be Dasein is to have this have this structuring of the attuned intelligibility of being in the world. And I guess what I want to say is that discourse is expressing the meaning of being in the world or something like that. But anyway, so discourse is that as an existential feature of Dasein, and then language is possible only because of that. So language doesn't first come and then discourse. It's the other way around. Discourse is a part of being in the world, and that makes language possible.
Well, it's an existential foundation of it. So when we say that it comes first, we can't be led into the trap of thinking it's like a like a cause and effect kind of or a temporal. The one
The
comes before the other
chronological,
temporally, right? They're
Right.
it's just more primordial than it, right?
Right. It's kind of like analogous to the transcendental conditions for the possibility of experiencing but it's either an existential or related to that. It's part of the constitution of Dasein. So like yeah, I'm agreeing. It's part of it's part of the constitution of Dasein that makes language possible. And he keeps doing this over and over. I forgot what the exact examples were in the previous section, but it's like, everybody thinks that this is primary and this other thing comes later. But he's like, no, actually, this other thing is primordial and that's the possibility for this, this other thing that we normally think, or that many people think is primary.
Yeah, it's the same thing that I mean, this is a characteristic of phenomenology and post-Kantian philosophy in general is like that, but Heidegger especially, I think, likes to tap into that's his transcendental reasoning, that the previously that's not a chronological previous, but you can think of it as a logical priority or previousness. And that's what the whole founding is and making possible. So that's his Kantianism right there. But a lot of phenomenology that's why it is it is Kantian basically. It's almost everything Merleau-Ponty talks about is okay, fine, we'll accept that, but that presupposes this whole thing that is not being given with what is said about whatever the claim is. So then it's about look at all these things that are presupposed by it that make it possible. And that's really become continental philosophy, I think, is almost indistinguishable from that kind of reasoning. But yeah, specifically for Heidegger, yeah, that's what he's saying about Dasein and language or discourse, really. Yeah. Yeah, the thing about discourse as the attuned intelligibility. So some of the stuff that he was saying about intelligibility was kind of interesting because I don't remember him really going into that and kind of giving it definitions and whatnot like he usually does. I may just have not been paying attention or whatever. But what is intelligibility exactly for him? Is that connected with, I think he introduced that with when he was talking about understanding and projection. Right? Is that I'm not sure.
I think that's right. I think that he ties intelligibility to meaning when he's introducing understanding.
Yeah, I think that's right. I remember, I think it's towards the very beginning of the reading. Yeah, section 33. So that's where he goes into what the statement or assertion is and how it kind of comes about. Well, it's a derivative mode of interpretation. So interpretation is grounded on understanding what is articulated as such an interpretation is meaning. So you've got understanding in terms of projecting possibilities, and then that is articulated through interpretation, and what what is articulated in interpretation is meaning. So I guess also what is articulated in interpretation would then be its intelligibility. That's what meaning is. Yeah,
And then discourse is then what I want to say. I'm not sure I can find the text though. In that chain, then discourse is like the is I want to say is the expression of meaning, the expression of intelligibility, something like that.
yeah, and
Yeah, the attuned. This is in the middle of Heidegger 161. The attuned intelligibility of being in the world expresses itself as discourse. So discourse is the expressing of the intelligibility of being in the world, and if Chase is right, then that would mean that discourse is the expression of meaning, I think. Maybe?
yeah, I think so. And then the statement is a making explicit of the intelligibility of discourse. I think. I don't know. I'm grasping at straws there, maybe a little.
I got the impression that statement well, let me say proposition. Maybe a proposition is a deficient mode of statement. I don't know, but propositions he's not real keen on. And I think because like he says something like, I don't know if he uses the word propositions, but in this deficient mode, statements basically turn beings ready to hand into beings present at hand. And so it essentially reduces the being in the world to a collection of objects. But maybe that's just is that just a deficient mode of statement that does that, or is that statement as such?
Well, so statement is a derivative mode of interpretation, as the title of section 33. And then, but then statement in relation to discourse, I'm not sure about that one.
Wait a minute. What would you say, Chase, about the title to 33?
So in the new translation, it's statement as a derivative mode of interpretation. So statement is assertion in the Macri and Robinson.
Yeah.
That part, though, about how the statement, assertion, proposition, how it moves from what is grasped in the ready to hand to the president at hand, that part I thought was great and showing. So that's kind of an example of showing a genesis of something. How does the president at hand come about? He kind of showed it right there and showed it how it works through this mode of making explicit statements out of what is normally just interpreted. So you have the hermeneutical as I interpret something as something, and then to make that explicit in a proposition, that's kind of a way of making it present at hand and moving it from ready to hand, where the interpretation is about equipment in this network of significance and context, then to be able to disarticulate that and then make it some kind of predicated subject in a proposition, that's what turns it into something present at hand, which also goes along with a kind of perception also, I'd say. But
yeah, I mean, it seems to me when I was reading that part that you could almost like similar to like when you're talking to someone, they might have a certain vibe or a certain kind of way of presenting themselves that can color the entire exchange, and you yourself involved in that, such that you might be able to take out, if you just had like a transcription of the data that was being transmitted, you might even be able to very accurately represent that, as a kind of series of statements, but you're missing this kind of contextual, existentially situated discourse that's happening, that's like, maybe if someone has like a condescending tone of voice or like a joyful tone of voice, like that kind of stuff doesn't necessarily translate, into like pencil and paper markings or whatever. But at least that was my interpretation of an element of what he's getting at with that.
Yeah, in regard to that, wanted to read the last part of the last full paragraph on Heidegger 163. So the Heidegger 163, the last full paragraph, but just the last few sentences. Being in and its attunement are made known in discourse and indicated in language by intonation, modulation, in the tempo of talk, in the way of speaking. The communication of the existential possibilities of attunement, that is, the disclosing of existence, can become the true aim of poetic speech. Maybe that's a sort of a prefiguring of later Heidegger, perhaps, I don't know. But to Matthew's point, look at what he says. Look at how he describes language here. He's not describing it as statements. He says in language by intonation, modulation, in the tempo of the talk, in the way of speaking, so that, and I don't know if it's exclusively that, but as Matthew is saying, there's something that is communicated through those aspects of language that is lost in just a series of propositional statements.
I wonder if there could be some kind of analysis about the difference between artificial intelligence and the way that, say, we use Dasein uses language. Would it be something like that? Would it be something that, I mean, maybe I have an old-fashioned idea of artificial intelligence. It's obviously it's changed a lot recently, but it's the way at least I understand it, it's based very much on a kind of propositional idea of language, at least to a certain extent, right? And I think it would be exactly that kind of intonation, modulation, tempo of talk, in the way of speaking, the way that you could, for lack of a better word, intuitively understand all those gestures together as a way of speaking, and that's part of the communication. It's kind of like that total package that's what it's very difficult to get across to artificial intelligence, is you can only do it if it's in this mode of a very specific, explicit kind of tying together of propositional statements in valid implication with each other. So that if you have this, then that. Seems, I don't know. Am I off base there on, maybe I just don't understand artificial intelligence, or I don't know.
You'd have to specify what kind of artificial intelligence you're talking about. And I think the one you're talking about, though, would be like large language models, right? Because I guess that's the thing, you have to like really specify like what you mean by the AI. Because like large language models, that's a kind of AI, but you see what I'm trying to say? Like it's not like Dolly is not the same thing per se.
Yeah, so I was thinking just whatever artificial intelligence thinks in a way of kind of programming language where you would move through kind of conditional statements, and that if you have A, then B, A, therefore B. But I'm not sure at all if how Dolly works really.
Well, yeah, most of the language models they do is they work by like having like indexes of references. So like they just have like references such that like Germany and Italy are like if you were to put them on a graph, like Germany and Italy are like referentially and indexally like near to Hitler and Mussolini. So it's just like all like reference and like basically just like inferring from like a web of associations and connections that are like graphed and then given like arbitrary, well not arbitrary, but like given like a sign, and so it just kind of like plots whatever it's fed into a graph and then like extracts out from that in a very like complicated way, which is
Okay,
I don't think anything like what we do.
so say it would be something like they'll take a bunch of pictures and take the hashtags from them and then base calculate those associations, and then through enough number of cases it can have a kind of probability map, probability space of the density of those associations with each other. Something like that, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Which I guess is still kind of at base using a kind of statement propositional kind of way of in the original programming.
So the way I think of large language models, and again, I'm no expert, so I might be wrong, but they, like what they scrape all this data from the internet, right? They which turns out they're kind of running out of data now. I heard a news report that they've scraped almost all the data, and now they're having a hard time figuring out where they're going to get more data. In fact, one of the big AI companies is thinking about buying Simon and Schuster specifically so they can scrape the data from all the publications of Simon and Schuster because they've run out of stuff. But they collect all this data, and my understanding what they do is these models, it's like a huge big data model, and they see the way people use statements in various kinds of situations and with regard to particular topics and so on. So these are the kinds of things that, I mean, to put it in Heideggerian terms, maybe, these are the kind of things that Das Mann says about this situation and this kind of knowledge and this. So it collects these and then it constructs these, it fabricates these sentences that mimic what appear, that mimics that. And so, that's why I was in the comment I made. It seems to me what the large language models do is they construct sentences that of the kind that Dasein might say if Dasein was having a certain kind of experience. So it's not like there is no Dasein there that is having an encounter with being in the world and is expressing that encounter. It is this processing algorithm observing a whole bunch of sentences, knowing the kind of situations that those arose from, and then using that, kind of like Chase was saying, kind of in a probability matrix where it's in this kind of situation where this kind of knowledge is at stake. This is typically what people say. And so then you construct these, these discourses through that method. So it seems to me like it's mimicking. It's kind of like, in philosophy of mind, the notion of zombies. You can have people running around talking and saying and doing things, but how do you know there's anyone home? How do you know there's really any light on in there, that they're really conscious? Maybe they're just mimicking human behavior. Well, that's the way I think of these large language models. They're just kind of mimicking what Dasein appears to be doing, but there isn't any Dasein there, and they're just copying aspects of the behavior and language.
So
I think, I was just gonna say, Nevin, I think it's a really interesting comment that it's like what Das Mann would say. I think it's because you are getting that probabilistic calculation of the most likely answer. Well, that's kind of the answer that one would say that.
the average,
Agreed.
So one thing I was just to follow up to what you're saying, Nevit. So large language models, they would essentially not really be answering that kind of the Chinese room counter argument that would say, okay, so if artificial intelligence isn't really Dasein, it's not really understanding in that existential sense that Heidegger talks about. And then large language models aren't doing anything really essentially different from the way that classical programming worked with artificial intelligence. Is that right?
What do you mean classical programming with artificial intelligence? You just mixed two things.
Oh, probably. I'd say right now, cause it's not obvious. I don't really know what I'm talking about with artificial intelligence. I don't know. But
and a lot of people, I'm not sure anybody really knows what they're talking about with it.
yeah, I mean,
Because it's a
artificial
big
intelligence
mixing
doesn't
of
know what it's talking
ideas.
about itself. So, but I mean, what I was thinking with that is, so the Chinese room thing is, there's somebody in a room that has a code book that says, if you get this response, respond with this. Write this character and respond. And you can have a whole conversation with this person in this locked room in Chinese while that person doesn't actually understand Chinese. They're just simply copying a set of codes. So it seemed like the same thing is going on with large language models. I mean, yeah, I don't know.
Except that I think that the large language models are not as algorithmic. So, traditional programming is I don't know if you've ever programmed it. It's very procedural, and you have, you know, these steps that you said if, then, and so on. But I actually don't know how they write these large language models. So I'm speaking partially out of ignorance here, but it's again a big data processing thing. So you've got this shit ton of data that again express what kinds of sentences people say in these situations, and then it correlates, like I think it's probably like you said, like some sort of probability thing, like given this person's asking, like I asked it some questions about Fichte once, and and I think it scrapes this data, and it's like, well, people who talk about Fichte and when in regard to this question tend to give this kind of answer, and that tend to is based on a huge gigantic wad of data. So I
It
don't
being
think that's
ChatGPT? Is that what you
what's
meant?
that.
Noah? You said you asked it. Did you mean
Oh
ChatGPT?
yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, because
I
there's
was
lots of large language models and there's lots of
right.
other
No, I was,
AIs outside
yeah,
of.
I was talking to Chat GPT. And the funny thing is, though, I can't remember what the question was. I mean, it was something I was really struggling with. And I was asking it this question. And eventually what it started doing is giving me two answers and asking me which one I liked best. And I'm like, what? you're you're supposed to be telling me the answer here. And it's like, well, look, here's one way to answer the question. Here's another way to answer the question. Which one of these two do you like better? So I guess it was starting to use me as a training model or something. Well, here's the question I don't know the answer to. Can you help train me? But the problem is I didn't know the answer because I was trying to figure it out. So anyway, that's just a side thing.
Yeah, it does the same thing. I've had it do that writing my quarterly, help me like write like quarterly review, like self review, or things like um asking it a question and then coming back later and then giving it the answer to that question when I found it. And so yeah, it does that quite often once you've been engaging with it for a long time. I guess the UI clocks how long you're sitting there with it, and then it'll say like if you're telling it to like make something shorter, it'll ask if like, oh, is it short enough or is this one better?
So it requires that feedback of Dasein. Dasein's understanding has to give it some kind of feedback, and that's what it actually uses as its data. I mean,
So though that's not necessarily true, I don't think. I mean, of all AI models, AI
No, because like I use one in
systems.
Westlaw, and Westlaw doesn't do that. Westlaw just like it just says this is what is in Westlaw, and it's like get over it, Bucko. That's the law. That's kind of what
And
it
if you're,
does.
if it's wrong enough, people stop using it, or it gets retrained. But like, there's AI that have been used to identify things in images, and uh, they get varied results. Sometimes they'll find that they're identifying based on background information. There's a fairly well-known case of one that was trying to identify, I don't know if it was Arctic foxes or something like that, and it it eventually got a whole bunch of them wrong, and they looked into it and they found there were pictures where there was a tree in the background with snow on it or something like that, and it had keyed in on that.
When we're talking about silence, maybe this is not the exclusive purpose of silence, but this is at the top of Heidegger 165. Authentic silence is possible only in genuine discourse. In order to be silent, Dasein must have something to say, that is, must be in command of an authentic and rich disclosedness of itself. So that leaves me out. Then reticent makes manifest and puts down idle talk. So at least one function of silence is to put down idle talk. I don't know if this is what he means, but I hate going. One reason I hate going to parties is because just people talk about dumb shit for hours, and so so I don't know if you've ever been in a situation and people are just yammering on about stuff, and you're like, God, what a
I think
bore.
that's exactly what he means. It's people are not being authentic in those cases, right? That's not a they're not being disclosive.
So
yeah,
in this section, I was like, oh, Heidegger's gonna make me do another defense of bullshit, and that's I think that this is another instance of anti-yapping, anti-bullshit, and I won't stand for it actually because I find it to be uh, a great way of disclosing and being,
But
but I don't have a full out thought for that.
you think idle talk is a good way of disclosing?
oh, okay, so I'll just say, for informational purposes, that in the next few sections, he'll talk about fallenness, and that's inauthenticity, and the inauthentic fallen mode of discourse is idle chatter. I can't remember what it is in the different interpretations, but basically exactly that, idle talk, idle chatter.
You
So,
know,
but
the whole
he
thing about
doesn't say that that's just like an inherently bad thing. I think he says that these fallen everyday modes, kind of like that is what there is. So you kind of need that as this what it
Yeah,
is. And
and
then
to
you get
preempt
authentic modes kind of on top of that, or
and
possibilities more so.
to 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 sort of, I think, preempt where I think maybe Tristan's going, though. He says in the very first sentence of that next section that it's not used disparagingly. He's not using this term disparagingly.
True.
Okay. So yeah, I was gonna say, like, as a guy who's like all like, his rustic Germanness and being out there all rustic and stuff, it's like, well, I don't know, maybe the rustic German and like the rustic American's different, but I feel like a big deal in just everyday life, especially in the rustic areas, is just sitting around a table yapping. I mean, that's what old men, like old folk, generally do. For the parts I come from, they would show when they closed down the coffee shop and the coffee shop biscuit diner spot. They all just started going to McDonald's and doing this, and so I just find that to be like that's that was a big deal. You show up, and if George wasn't there, it was kind of significant. What's going on with George? Blah blah blah. It's kind of deal. So I found that to be like a very like interesting thing. I wonder, like, what his like. Was it the case that he ever like stopped by to do yapping with like the local shepherd or whatnot?
I think that it's just that when we're talking about other people, when we're talking about those sort of mundane things, we're not making that that Dasein to Dasein connection, that Mitsein connection that we are when and like Jay said, he's not saying we can do that all the time, or that we should even try to. It's not a. It's this is more about understanding the nature of Dasein than it is about how we ought to do things, right? But that we're getting closer to that understanding Dasein in those moments when we are sort of truly connecting with people.
Yeah, if you look at that list of well, this is that same couple statements at the bottom of Heidegger 163. Being in and its attunement are made known in discourse and indicated in language by intonation, modulation, and tempo of talk and the way of speaking. The communication of the existential possibilities of attunement, that is, the disclosing of existence, can become the true poetic aim of speech. So if you're disclosing attunement and through these things like intonation, modulation, tempo, and so on, then it seems like you could have a conversation. I don't know what the difference between that and idle talking, but you could have a conversation. You could have for example, you don't have to have a bunch of philosophers in order to have this kind of conversation, right? You can have a conversation that conveys attunement through these means. I don't know. I mean, maybe, I guess I wonder to what degree does it really matter? I was going to say, does it matter what you're talking about? But he does say discourse is discourse about. But maybe as long as it's disclosing attunement, maybe, I don't know. But I mean, surely Heidegger wouldn't say, well, only kind of like Plato. Well, only philosopher kings can know the truth. I'm guessing that Heidegger would not say only philosophers can have. If he would use the term authentic communication, I kind of doubt that.
Yeah, I think that that does not seem like a Heideggerian way of. If anything, philosophers are less likely to be in the world in a very authentic way, I think, in many cases.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, this is kind of, I think, bleeding into his later work, but he would say that the poets are better able to have authentic speech or discourse or whatnot. And that, I mean, if it was the case that only philosophers could do this, it would be a kind of reductio ad absurdum of his argument.
Which suggests that this is leaning towards an emotional kind of disclosiveness. That
or
when you're
attuned or
and when you're disclosive, maybe you're disclosive. Maybe you were talking about disclosive to some extent of feelings. We're talking about disclosiveness. We're talking about sharing stuff, right? We're talking about about your opening up um, your world to the other to the others that you're with. And I think that that's just not what you're doing when you're talking, when you're doing that other kind of talk, idle talk. You're just talking about the people down the street, talking about your neighbors. You're talking about that's not sharing things about yourself. That's not opening up.
It also seems to run counter to, I mean, it's maybe more evidence of his kind of running counter to Plato, like to the extent, didn't Plato somewhere talk about how poetry is sort of like this shitty thing that we, or not shitty, but it's just like not as good as, because the poet isn't able to like get at the real deal
mimetic.
the way,
Yeah. It's
He wants to
imitation.
ban them, doesn't he? Doesn't he want to ban the poets?
Yeah.
right, yeah. So speaks to him trying to not, maybe it's there's a critique there of Plato and the way he's viewing poetry.
I was going to say, in spite of the fact that Plato is a kind of poet, I always find it funny that, you have a guy writing in dialogue that is beating up on poets and artistic expression, and yet he's anyway. So it may be something more subtle going on there, but
Yeah. Well, in the Phaedrus, he talks shit about writing in a writing, which I mean, obviously he's Plato. He's aware of what he's doing in the sense that it's ironic, but that's just Platonic Socratic irony.
I know Heidegger apparently was a huge fan of Rilke.
yeah, love Rilke.
It quotes
the poet
quotes an
guy.
extensive passage of Rilke, right, in one of his other
Yeah,
books.
yeah. I know you're talking about who eventually became familiar with who's the woman that Nietzsche was in love with? Not
Salome,
Wagner, but
Salome something.
yeah. I think Salome, and I can't, how do you say his name?
Rilke?
Oh, yeah. I think they did something together. Yeah. I forgot what I was gonna say something else in response to, I don't know. I need to do my goddamn taxes.
Ooh, you've only got a few hours.
Yeah, I think
Just file an extension, Chase.
that sounds like a lot of
I
effort. I mean,
it's just a
I
one
can do it
pager.
I can do it in yeah. I could
You
probably
have to
do it in an
file
hour.
you have to file Form EZ, don't you? Oh no, you got to claim. You have to
No, I
claim
don't.
some. You get student credits,
Yeah, I don't have
tuition
enough
credits.
credits for any of that. But I have Obamacare, just thanks to insurance